no matter if we have military supplies from our foreign allies or not, because Ukrainian nation has been fighting for centuries. Ukraine was occupied by Russian Empire, by the Nazi Germany, by the Third Reich, by Soviet Union, and the fact is there's no more Russian Empire, and there's no more Third Reich, and there is no more Soviet Union, but there is Ukraine. And I think that this is the best evidence that Ukraine will win.
Hello. This week marks the third-year anniversary of the liberation of Bucha, just north of us here in Kiev. It also marks the 3-year anniversary of the discovery of what was happening there during Russian occupation. The war crimes, the massacre, the mass grave. We speak about it with friend of the show, Operator Starsky, who was there and tells a harrowing tale. As such, this episode comes with a warning. We are going to be discussing topics that are deeply disturbing. But if you have to step away, that's fine. Although I urge you to watch it in its entirety, because we cannot avert our eyes. We cannot let those who committed these crimes, or those who commanded them into Ukraine and enabled them to commit this kind of brutality. They cannot go without consequence. They cannot go without punishment, or at the very least, the acknowledgement of what happened. And furthermore, any country out there that believes in the rule of law, if this incident is not enough for us to recognize that it is good and just to support the Ukrainians as they resist this kind of inhumanity, then it will only be repeated. So, gird yourself. This isn't easy, but we can never forget. Hey, Starsky, thank you for coming back on again. I wish we had a better topic to discuss, but we have to acknowledge the 3-year anniversary of Bucha, and you were there. So tell me your experience with what happened in Bucha.
Approximately this time of 2022, like 2nd or 3rd of April, I was called by my command because journalists arrived, and I was among few officers who spoke English. So we went to Bucha because it was just liberated. That whole area Russians withdrew from Hostomel, European Bucha area. And I brought them there to show them around. And one of the things that they wanted to see was that trench that was discovered near the church. The way we discovered this trench was using satellites. We noticed that Russians were doing something in that area, constructing something, and turned out that it was a trench. And they were basically dumping civilian bodies into this trench. This could be clearly seen from the satellites, also using drones. And this is how we found that place. One interesting thing about it was that in the yard of this church, there were piles of like tiles used for pavement, like cobblestones. So apparently they wanted to bury all those people, and eventually, because they considered that they were staying there forever, eventually cover that area with the pavement so nobody would find them. And when we arrived there, we saw this tremendous pit. It wasn't excavated completely. We saw approximately 14 bodies on surface. Some of them were already in the black bags. They were excavated and prepared by Ukrainian forensic experts in order to be transported later to the morgue. And underneath them, there were layers of those bodies. And there were civilians. I didn't see anybody wearing military uniforms. They were mostly civilians, different ages, men, women, and I saw several bodies. One of them was actually wrapped in like a bedspread. Apparently, it was a child because the body itself wasn't really big. And we found 14 people only on surface, what we could see, those people that were excavated so far at that very moment. Of course, journalists were absolutely speechless because this is something that you don't expect to see in the 21st century in a European country. But this is what we saw. Besides those bodies, as soon as our soldiers entered the area, we found a lot of corpses. There was a pile of burned corpses. It was actually a family that was killed simultaneously, instantly. And Russians wanted to dispose of those bodies. They set them on fire, but they didn't burn well. And a lot of people, a lot of remains were actually scattered on the streets. And there were hundreds of them. There were a lot of them literally lying on the streets, on the sidewalks. So it was a hard thing to see, a very, very disturbing picture.
Yeah, without getting too graphic, what did you see, or what did your fellow soldiers, your Ukrainian soldiers, see as the cause of death? How were they killing these civilians?
There were two main causes. One was gunshot wounds, and the other one was fragments, like shell fragments. So a majority of them died either of shell fragments or they were shot.
And shot, from what I hear, execution style. Does that meet with what you saw?
They were shot in different ways. Those that were found in cars, for example, trying to escape from Bucha,
Yes.
they were not necessarily executed. They were shot from the Russian positions, but there were also bodies found. For example, one body was found in a sewer. That was a body that belonged, I believe, to a mayor or one of the authorities, one of the local authorities. And he was executed and hidden. His corpse was hidden in the sewer. And there were also multiple civilians found in basements with their hands tied behind their backs, and those were literally executed. They were shot at point blank.
Did you speak to anybody who was a resident of Bucha who had survived the occupation and were witnesses? What did they tell you, if you did?
I spoke to numerous people. One of them worked as a delivery man. He delivered like furniture and things like that. He had a truck, so this is how he earned money. And he said that when this massacre in Bucha started, he managed to withdraw with his family, but he said that all of his neighbors, and there were 3 teenagers, among his neighbors. They were killed. Also, his father-in-law was killed when he went outside to find cigarettes, and he was shot by Russians. So literally, they were killing mercilessly. They were killing anybody, regardless of gender, regardless of age. It was uh, a demonstration of what the Russian intentions really were.
What did you think when you saw it?
Was hard to think about anything, actually. As a military, of course, try to stay cold-minded and
Professional.
yes, I was bringing journalists there. I was showing them around. Some of them tried to interview the forensic experts. Later, foreign investigators arrived. But I tried to do all I could to bring as many journalists there as possible and explain them what happened, because it's crucial to make sure that all those crimes are documented, that nobody can say that, oh, it was staged, or Ukrainians did when they arrived, because the pictures of the civilian bodies scattered on the streets, they were there and they were made there by satellites while Russians still controlled that territory. And for example, that civilian that was shot while he was on a bike, his body was there for 2 weeks, approximately 2 weeks, on a street. And later, when we liberated the area, this body was brought to the morgue. Was really hard to describe the feeling, because this is not something that you really expect to see. So to me, it was hard. Try to stay professional, but to me, it was really hard, and especially after time when you think about it, and when you hear some authorities from a different country talking about Bucha as a propaganda tour, this is something extremely triggering.
I can imagine, and I want to talk to you about that more. But I want to ask you first that even with the long history between Ukrainians and Russians, and the cruelty that Russians have committed against Ukrainians, Bucha was really something different, I think. Do you think it was a surprise, a shock to Ukrainians to see just how evil, there's no other word for it, that the Russians can be? Did it shock even the Ukrainians?
I would say so. I would say so. The reason is because you can literally come there and see it yourself. That area wasn't guarded, so literally anybody from the street could walk to that church and see the mass grave and the forensic experts working. It was free for everybody to enter and see themselves. We have a long history, as you said, and for example, when you read books of Horlys-Gorsky about those death factories organized by Russian Bolsheviks even before the World War II, when you read about the queues of civilian people that were being shot by Russian Bolsheviks, and you imagine all that, it's something that happened 100 years ago, and you cannot really understand, you cannot really feel it, probably. But when you see yourself a big trench full of civilian bodies, and you see all those piles of pavement that was supposed to be installed above them so nobody would ever find those bodies, then you realize the whole depth of Russian atrociousness.
Yeah, I've been out to the site at Izium and I don't think I'll forget it anytime soon. Um, I've been up to Bucha and Hostomel and all the rest of it, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. What you talk about um, propaganda and those people who say that what happened in Bucha, or indeed all these other massacres, are just Ukrainian propaganda. What do you say, having been an eyewitness to it? What's your reaction to people who say this is, like even people who say that it's a propaganda tour, as you say? What's your reaction to this narrative that it's all made up?
When people speak about it in the media, in their social media, of course, those people are completely wrong. A lot of those people have never been to Bucha. They can only judge what happened from the pictures and videos. And of course, there's a lot of Russians trying to convince them that all that was staged, that there were actors, also mannequins used, and also all they were shot by Ukrainians. But the sheer number of journalists who documented this, and journalists coming from all around the world, the sheer number of those investigators who also documented those crimes, is a good confirmation that it's not fake, it happened for real, and this is the true face of the Russian world, of the Russian atrociousness. But when a vice president of a country that considered democracy and freedom its main values for many, many decades, if not centuries, when this person calls this massacre, this absolutely terrifying tragedy, a propaganda tour, that is a completely different level, in my opinion. That is a completely different level, and this person, again, in my opinion, probably should apologize to hundreds of Ukrainian families who lost their relatives that were shot by Russian invaders for nothing, just because Russians are naturally atrocious and they are terrorists, basically. I think that if this individual respects himself, he must apologize.
Well, personally, I agree 100%. And it's even worse because Vladimir Putin, they're not even ashamed of it in some ways. They don't even hide it. Vladimir Putin gave medals to members of the brigade that were in Bucha. I mean, they're in some ways proud of it. What do you think when you see Vladimir Putin? What do you think about when Russians glorify what they're doing here?
It's not surprising, for example, recently one of the war criminals who committed those crimes and commanded his troops in Bucha was identified, and he was given um, a chair of a mayor of a region in a Orenburg Oblast of Russia. When we see that, I personally I don't feel surprised because Russians will always try to encourage the Russian regime will encourage its terrorists to participate in this war because they need more manpower for the meat assaults. So they need more people to burn to capture square meters of Ukrainian territory. And of course, this is something that we can anticipate. On the other hand, this also brings a lot of problems to the Russian society because on my channel, for example, I often talk about the Russian criminals, and we're talking about murderers, rapists who agreed to get recruited and fight in Ukraine, kill Ukrainian people, and then they returned home and they continued committing their crimes. And this is something that they deserve, of course, but it's not like Putin really cares about it.
Yeah, what do you think is going to ever happen to these people? Do you think they're ever going to be held accountable?
Absolutely, absolutely. There are many, many cases. There is Radovan Karadzic, who thought that he will never face responsibility. There was Milosevic, who also thought that he will never face responsibility. There are many cases that confirm that war criminals can be punished. And to those who don't believe that they can be punished, there is a um, I don't want to sound like a terrorist, of course, but there are other measures, and I think that Israel confirmed that those measures also work. So, I respect people who believe in God, but I also think that criminals must face responsibility while they're still here on this side, right? And I believe that there are measures to make it happen.
Are you concerned that there may be other Buchas or Izium or all the other massacres that we know about? Do you think there are more that we haven't heard about in the territories that are currently occupied by the Russians?
Absolutely. For example, in Mariupol, there is already an aerial footage and also satellite footage of graves that emerged after Russia occupied the city, and there is a big, massive area covered with those graves. It is anticipated that between 10 and 20,000 civilians can be buried there. But of course, we didn't expect to find another civilian mass grave in Izium, for example, after we liberated this town. And it's not a big town, but the number of those graves found there, it's absolutely astonishing. Unfortunately, I believe that we will learn about new cases because Russian atrocities is something they don't really talk much about, right? And they do all they can to cover those crimes to make sure that nobody will ever find about them, but they will fail.
What are your hopes and what are your concerns about what the international community can do to discover these crimes and to keep those who committed them accountable?
My biggest concern is, for example, looking at what's happening right now in the United States, because we all know that Trump administration currently canceled canceled funding of several projects that were documenting and investigating Russian crimes. There was a specific group that investigated the Russian crimes committed against Ukrainian children. We're talking about the 20,000 Ukrainian kids that were forcefully deported to the Russian-controlled territory and brought to the military camps for kids, where they're being indoctrinated and taught how to operate weapons, how to use military tactics. The recent news that we've heard is that this group restored its funding, so they will kind of keep operating, but we will see, because there were several big projects that actually cooperated with Ukrainian law enforcement as well as international groups that were collecting and processing this data to make sure that in future the Russian war criminals will face responsibility. Those projects already lost their funding, and my biggest concern is that the data that they collected and all the efforts that were put into investigating those crimes, they can be in vain eventually. Eventually we can lose all those extremely important evidence, because again, we should always respect the law, and we should always make our decisions based on different facts, evidence, and documents. And this is extremely crucial to protect this data for the future.
Yeah, I mean, the massacre at Srebrenica For example, in the former Yugoslavia, it still traumatizes Europeans. So it shocks me to a certain degree that they're being far less um, aggressive and proactive in trying to hold these people accountable. I mean, even those who were responsible for Srebrenica, some of them escaped responsibility, and some of them never saw the inside of a courtroom. They died in their beds, comfortable. Uh, do you share the same concern that for some reason there's a double standard when it comes to Russia?
I will tell you more about those people in Srebrenica. Some of them are fighting in Ukraine against Ukrainian people nowadays.
The Serbs, yeah. I mean, I have no doubt.
Yeah, recently one of the most notorious Serbian Chetniks was eliminated. He fought in Ukraine since, I believe, 2014, and luckily he became a better person. So, of course, there is,
Underground.
yeah, of course, there are a lot of concerns like that. Criminals must be punished. Let's be honest, we all want to live in a safe society. We want to be protected by the law. And this is something that I myself, as a former policeman, completely support the idea that we should live in a safe society. We should have this confidence that our kids will go to school and back and they will never meet a terrorist on the street, right? Even if it's like an ex-terrorist who was shooting at their father, for example, several years ago. This is important. This is important to make sure that we live in a healthy society. Criminals must be punished, and criminals must not be endorsed or encouraged. Because again, when we hear different narratives coming from our allies on the West, that Russians are actually absolutely beautiful people who want peace and things like that. And when they say that, I always remember about the things that I saw in places like Bucha, in places like Bakhmut and Chasiv Yar, and I understand that those people, they simply don't know what they're talking about. We should never encourage or endorse terrorists because this gives a signal to other dictators and tyrants that they can basically do whatever they want if they have power and nobody will stop them.
Yeah, the idea of never again, and yet it happens again and again. What do you think? I mean, Srebrenica still resonates in Europe. What do you think the legacy of Bucha, when people hear the word Bucha in the future, what legacy and meaning will the terrible events there have, do you think?
Currently, it's a word associated with massacre, unfortunately. But, I lived there a couple of years already after that massacre happened. I lived in the area until 2023. And I would really like this word to be associated with resilience because already in 2023, when you come to Bucha, you could see people rebuilding their houses, people opening their grocery stores and kiosks. And to me personally, this is a name associated with resilience that despite this horrible tragedy, people are still resilient. They still have hope for a better life. 2022, the spring of 2022, immediately after liberation of Bucha, this place was, I don't know if the word depressing can even describe it, because there were just few people on the street. You could not see a lot of people because they either moved out or died, and there were just few people on the street. their eyes were absolutely empty from all the horror that they survived, and the streets were absolutely gray. The buildings were damaged by the combat, and the whole atmosphere of fear in this city, it's not even a city, it's a tiny town, it was actually overwhelming and depressing. But already next year, when I went to the downtown, and it was already a summer, and I saw people returning back and rebuilding their homes, bringing new furniture instead of the furniture that was snatched by Russian terrorists, because in Bucha, almost all the apartments, all the private houses were robbed and looted by Russians. When I saw this life returning back, especially when McDonald's opened in Bucha finally, yeah, it was something, of course, very, very much motivating. And later, when Russians started striking the energy infrastructure in Ukraine, 2022, 2023, in winter, in Bucha, there was some of the best invincibility points established by the Ukrainian police and Ukrainian rescue service. And I also made a video from it just to show that in Bucha, people, despite all they went through and despite all they were going through, they keep being resilient and strong. And this is something that I would like the word Bucha to be associated with in the future.
Yeah, and I'll take it even further. One step further is that I think it shows the difference between the character of the Ukrainian people and the character of the Russian people. Because take, for example, Grozny in Chechnya. I remember for years and years and years, it was left with, carcasses of buildings because of the war and the battle there. And the Russians just didn't do anything about it for I don't know how long, maybe a decade. And then Kadyrov comes in and maybe they do some cosmetic repairs and rebuilding of Grozny. But for a very long time, they just left it destroyed. Whereas Ukrainians, the second that they are able to start to rebuild and recover, they do it immediately. They re-beautify things, they rebuild things. What do you think about my example that I'm drawing there, that this shows a clear division between the culture and mentality of the two different countries?
This observation is absolutely correct, because as soon as we returned to the area of Hostomel, for example, the streets were so littered, so it was actually really dangerous to drive a car, because there were a lot of fragments on the streets, a lot of corpses, of course, a lot of remains of the Russian vehicles, some Ukrainian vehicles as well. And in just 2 weeks, all the streets were absolutely clean. I remember I was going to the base and I saw a group of 10 or 20 communal workers that were literally sweeping the street and cleaning it from all the debris to make sure that people can walk and cars can pass. And it's a good example of Ukrainian resilience, of course. But speaking of Russian culture of abandoning, places like Grozny, it's not a surprise. For example, the South Ossetia, the places that they entered in 2008, Tskhinval. Generally, I would like our viewers to open their Google and search for the most recent photos from places like Abkhazia, South Ossetia. They will be impressed, because whatever the Russian Mir is touching turns into ruins. Donetsk,
The Russian world, Ruski Mir.
Russian world, yeah. In Donetsk, for example, they still the locals, the citizens, they still have no water. And this is the place that was promoted in the Russian media as, like this new emerging Russian republic with Russian culture that became part of Russia, again, according to the Russian terrorists. In 2022, in 3 years, they still didn't manage to establish even water supplies for their citizens. But generally speaking, not many citizens left there because majority of the Russian population has been completely eliminated and recruited and killed in the meat assaults. This is Russian culture. This is what they are, and this is something that can explain everything that happens in Russia. The reason one family in six still uses an outhouse because they don't care, they don't have sewers. That is according to Russian statistics. The reason that so many people in Russia live beyond poverty and they also don't care much. The reason that I think as much as half Russian towns further than 50 kilometers from Moscow don't have things like sewers, electricity, and grocery stores that would work like 24/7. Because they don't really care. This is their culture based on violence and corruption, and I don't know what more can I add here.
Yeah, I mean, you see like Putin visiting Mariupol, but he goes at night, so you can't see beyond what they want you to see, and what they show are these Potemkin village kind of brand new buildings that they've built in Mariupol for propaganda purposes. But then at the same time, you hear reports of these buildings having been made so quickly and for propaganda purposes that they're already starting to fall apart. And they're made with bad construction practices. So I couldn't agree with you more. But it also makes me wonder about some of these reports that we heard, particularly in places like Bucha and Irpin and Hostomel, these places to the northwest of the capital, these suburbs. And if the audience isn't aware of this, I'll inform you is that these are very nice suburbs. These are upper middle class, lower upper class. I mean, they're really nice suburbs. And we heard these reports of these Russian soldiers when they came in and took these towns. Part of the motivation for grabbing people and executing them was that they demanded, where are the Nazis? Where are the Nazis? Because where are the banderasi? Where are the Ukrainian Nazis? And because there aren't any Ukrainian Nazis in these nice suburbs, that is said to be partly the motivation for their aggression and their criminality and their their war crimes. But there's another story that there was deep resentment among the Russian soldiers when they showed up in these towns and saw how Ukrainians were living and their standard of living, said things like, who gave you permission to live like this? And that added to the resentment that they felt towards Ukrainians. Did you hear any of those stories as well? What kind of stories did you hear from how Russians, when they came in and occupied Ukrainian cities and found they were so nice, or whatever other motivation, what kind of stories did you hear about that kind of stuff?
I heard a story from my local. There was this cow farm in the area, and Russians were so amazed that we have plastic windows on the farm in the place where we keep the cows. The Russians apparently never saw anything like that, specifically those who arrived. Of course, they all expected to see, like, this poor Ukraine that, of course, officially Russians have bigger salary. They're of course wealthier than Ukrainians, but for some reasons I cannot quite explain, turns out that Ukrainians actually have a good quality of life comparing to Russians. And we can provide for our families, we can live in a good apartment and have proper life, while Russians don't have any of that. When you see Russian generals or Russian commanders coming to like those izbas, right? Those Russian wooden houses that were built like 100 years ago, and meeting widows of Russian soldiers or their mothers. That again, that explains everything. That explains the difference. But there was another additional reason why Russians were so much atrocious to the people of Bucha, people of Hostomel. It's because they tried to go through Bucha, through the Vokzalny Street to Kiev. They tried to break through Ukraine's defense and get to Kiev. This it was their primary target. The whole reason the Russian troops were in the Kiev Oblast was that they wanted to push towards Kiev and take control of the capital. And if it happened, then the war would probably stop very fast. But they failed, and the big column full of Russians, full of Chechen Kadyrovites, on that street, it was ambushed and destroyed. And Russians were surprised with how many soldiers they were losing on a daily basis. They didn't expect Ukrainians to be so fierce in their resilience. They didn't expect such a resistance from Ukrainian people. So when they started losing so many men on a daily basis, they weren't prepared for this, and they got scared. And of course, when you're scared and when you cannot really do anything to Ukrainian soldiers, then you can, of course, commit atrocious crimes against the locals that basically cannot protect themselves. In Hostomel, for instance, near the military base, there is this small area full of civilian houses. There are like 5-story buildings. And when Kadyrovites came to that place, they told the citizens, the people who lived there, they told them to leave. Otherwise, they would be shot. So they left, and Kadyrovites used those houses as their barracks, basically not far from the military base. But at the same time, if you visited that location, I think that you remember that there were a lot of Russian sandbags on the upper floor, because those floors were used as observation points. So Russians literally banished all the locals from their own houses, from their own apartments, and moved in. And the Kadyrovites were especially atrocious towards the locals, because they would shoot all the dogs. Every household, because it's like cottages, like country houses. Every household would have a dog, which is a normal thing in a Ukrainian household. And because Kadyrovites consider dogs like dirty animals, they would literally go and shoot them. So they would break into a household, and if there was a dog, they would shoot it on sight. Some of them, again, the stories are different. I've heard a story about a woman that said that Russians were helping to protect her against Russians. Some of the Russian officers, apparently, they would make sure that those people are not touched, because they knew how atrocious their own army was. But that is a single story that I've heard. Okay, the rest of
the exception, not the rule.
Of course, there are exceptions. We all understand that not all the Russian invaders are criminals. It's obvious. But on the other hand, the concentration of them is astonishing. At this very point, there is approximately 800 Russian invaders involved in the invasion of Ukraine, in the aggression against Ukraine. And already Ukrainian General Prosecutor Office launched more than 140,000 cases.
I'm sorry, 800,000 Russian soldiers. And how many again have open cases?
More than 140,000 criminal cases against those Russian war criminals who committed crimes against Ukrainian children, including sexual crimes, including strikes on civilian infrastructure. So basically, every fourth Russian invader committed crimes in Ukraine. And this is crazy. Every fourth, every fifth Russian soldier committed crimes. And those are only cases that are based on testimonies of witnesses, on evidences and things like that. We don't know about all the cases that happened on the occupied territory because Russians don't let any international observers to assess the situation. They don't let the Red Cross also to assess the situation, find if there are maybe people who need some kind of help. So unfortunately, I believe that we will hear much more facts about the Russian atrocities after the war is finished, maybe even earlier.
Yeah, I think that would be a good thing because I want them to be held accountable. But Ukrainians were always going to resist Russia's invasion, full-scale invasion. I mean, I remember the period from coming here from the period between 2014 and 2022 when Ukrainians were anticipating a full invasion and they were preparing, they were getting motivated. Obviously, Ukrainians know the history of being controlled by Moscow, so they were always going to fight. So the question of resistance was never in doubt. But when they saw these crimes, these atrocities, the cruelty of the occupation, for your average Ukrainian, do you think it provides them greater motivation to fight and resist?
Absolutely. Because again, years of Russian propaganda portrayed Russians as those honorable and noble soldiers, officers, like military traditions of Russian officers and things like that, which don't exist. It's
and the holy aspect of it too. They do the Russian Orthodox holy soldiers fighting for God sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely, especially Kadyrovites. But the Russian traditions of Russian officers that are limited to like sending plenty of troops into a meat grinder, that is something that we could see. But despite all those years of the propaganda, Russian TV shows like Kadety or something like that, despite all that, we, as Ukrainians, we could tell the truth because we lived next to this atrocious neighbor for centuries, and unfortunately we have a long history of being invaded by Russian terrorists and Russian invaders through centuries. And seeing those atrocities, it's a very strong reminder of why Ukrainians don't want Russian terrorist regime to rule them, because this is exactly what will happen to Ukrainians. But this time, nobody will defend you if you just surrender to them. Now we have a chance to fight against Russian atrocities and Russian terrorism. We have chance to punish the terrorists and punish the criminals. And this is extremely important. And if Ukrainian nation just capitulates, every Ukrainian understands that Russians will come to their Zhytomyr, to their Ivano-Frankivsk, to their Kropivnitsky, Odessa, and they will turn this city into Bucha, but this time it will be without a significant resistance. So this is something we don't want, and this is why Ukrainians will fight, and they will keep fighting, no matter if we have military supplies from our foreign allies or not, because Ukrainian nation has been fighting for centuries, and the best evidence that Ukrainians always win is that Ukraine was occupied by Russian Empire, by the Nazi Germany, by the Third Reich, by Soviet Union, and the fact is there's no more Russian Empire, and there's no more Third Reich, and there is no more Soviet Union, but there is Ukraine, and I think that this is the best evidence that Ukraine will win.
I agree 100%. Slava Ukraine.
Героям слава.
The other thing that I've witnessed this week, and this has been a very difficult week, because I've seen people laying flowers. I've seen people reflecting on 3 years since we discovered the crimes in Bucha. And it's a moment in time when I think people are reflecting. But it's also important to recognize, and maybe for an American audience in particular, is this idea of, in America, we would say, remember the Alamo. I think Bucha motivates Ukrainians to never give up and never surrender to this kind of brutality and animalistic cruelty. So Ukrainians get this, and they are marking this week. But as we conclude our conversation, and I wish we had a better topic to talk at, what do you want the world to remember and be aware of when they think of Bucha?
I want the people to always remember one thing, that this tragedy has been absolutely distorted by Russian propaganda, and the reason why people, talking heads spreading Russian narratives are dangerous is because those people know that they lie. They know that they lie about this tragedy being a show, being fake, being a propaganda tour. When there is a Russian invader coming from some Russian town far away who recruited, for money to kill people in Ukraine. In most cases, he doesn't really even know the whole situation. He doesn't care because this is the way he was raised in the terrorist federation. He was brainwashed since his birth. And when he comes to Ukraine, he's atrocious because he doesn't know the situation, because of the brainwashing he went through. But the people who spread the lies about this tragedy, people who say that mannequins were used, people who say that Ukrainians killed their own citizens, they are the worst because they know that they spread the lies. And I want people from around the world to be aware of that, because those people are even more dangerous than the Russian terrorists themselves.
I see your perspective, and I agree with that 100%. But I also want to see every damn Russian soldier off of this soil as soon as possible, and those who committed these kind of crimes to be held accountable. Look, we will keep combating that propaganda. I agree with you. You and I have efforts that we're going to be working on together in the future. But it's important for us to mark this moment in time and to never forget Bucha, and to make sure that those are crimes that are punished, that those who committed them are punished. Do you have anything else you want to add before we conclude here? This has been a tough week for all of us, but if you wanted to say one last thing, what would it be?
I would probably like to traditionally say thank you to all the viewers who will be watching this video, because if you're watching this video, 99% that you're supporting Ukraine and you're supporting my people, and this means that you also support democracy and freedom. And this means that we have the same values. So thank you so much for watching this video. Please share and help Ukraine be heard. And thank you for being decent. And thank you for standing with Ukraine, because this is the proper thing to do.
All right. Operator Starsky, I always appreciate speaking with you. It's always informative. I hope that you found this, as difficult as the topic is, enlightening, and additionally, it will motivate you to continue to support Ukraine. You can obviously follow Operator Starsky's efforts. We're trying to grow our audience as well. So if you did find this informative and enlightening, as difficult as it was, please click the subscribe and share button, the notification button. And we will keep doing this, you and me, Starsky, because this is important. And there should never, ever be another Bucha. Thanks for your time, buddy.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.